Hello everyone, I am the Midnight Storyteller. I know you clicked on this video to relax for a while or perhaps to let my voice help you fall asleep. Before you do, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you now? And what time is it? Alright, find a comfortable position and relax. When Sarah and I bought this house, it felt like settling into the future. It wasn't new, probably built sometime in the late 70s, but it had good bones, a decent yard, and importantly, enough space for us to grow into. We spent weeks painting, repairing, making it ours. There was one room upstairs, overlooking the quiet back garden, that we immediately designated as the nursery. Not that we were expecting immediately, but it felt right, hopeful. We painted it a soft, neutral yellow, dreaming of tiny furniture and mobiles gently turning in the sunlight that streamed through the window. For a while, it was simply an empty, optimistic room, waiting. The first hint that something was amiss was mundane, easily dismissed. While cleaning the room one afternoon, preparing to lay down a rug, I noticed a distinct chill in the far corner, the one diagonally opposite the door. It was a warm day, the rest of the house stuffy, but this one spot felt cool. Must be a draft from the window. I'd called out to Sarah, who was working downstairs. She came up, checked the window seals, they were tight. We checked the vent closed. Strange, but we shrugged it off. Old houses have their quirks, but the cold spot didn't go away. It persisted day after day, night after night. It wasn't just cool, it was cold. A damp, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards and walls in that specific corner, roughly a 3-foot square area. Even when we cranked up the heating in the rest of the house, that corner remained stubbornly frigid. We bought a digital thermometer and tested it. The temperature in that spot was consistently 10, sometimes 15 degrees lower than the rest of the room. It defied logic. There were no pipes running through there, no obvious source of the chill. It just was. We tried to ignore it, reasoning it was some bizarre insulation flaw we'd address later. We even placed a small, colorful rug over the area, hoping to contain it visually, if not physically. We left a basket with a few soft baby blankets and a single, plush teddy bear in the room, symbols of our future plans, trying to reclaim the space with warmth and intention. Then came the sounds. Faint, almost impossibly so. Late at night, when the house was utterly still, lying in bed in our room down the hall, sometimes one of us would say, "Did you hear that?" It was never clear, a breathy, melodic fragment that might have been a lullaby, carried on the air like a half-forgotten memory, or a tiny heartbreaking sigh or whimper, so soft it could easily have been the wind or the house settling. We could never pinpoint the source, but the feeling persisted that it drifted from the direction of the empty nursery. I often heard it more clearly than Sarah, which led to hushed, slightly tense discussions in the dark. Was I imagining it? Was I becoming overly sensitive to the house's noises? The objects we'd left in the room began to shift. It was never dramatic. We'd go in during the day, perhaps to air the room out, and noticed the teddy bear wasn't quite where we'd left it, tilted slightly, or moved an inch closer to the cold corner. The neatly folded blankets might look subtly disturbed, as if a small, unseen hand had tugged at them. We'd look at each other, unspoken questions hanging in the air. Did you move this? No. Did you? We'd try to rationalize vibrations, a slant in the floor we hadn't noticed. But the feeling of unease grew, prickling at the edges of our hopeful plans for the room. The cold spot itself seemed to be growing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, over weeks, the area of intense chill felt larger. The rug no longer quite covered it. The coldness now extended, maybe 4 feet out from the corner, creeping across the floorboards like an invisible stain. Standing near it felt like having the warmth leach directly from your body. More disturbing than the cold or the faint sounds, however, was the feeling that permeated the room, especially near that corner. It wasn't just cold, it was a profound, inexplicable sadness. an aching sense of loss, of longing, so thick it felt like you could taste it in the air. Spending more than a few minutes in the room left both Sarah and me feeling drained, heavy, hearted, sometimes on the verge of tears for no apparent reason. We started avoiding the room subconsciously, finding excuses not to go in there unless necessary. The bright, hopeful yellow on the walls began to feel like a mockery. We started finding the nursery door slightly ajar in the mornings, even when we were certain we had closed it firmly the night before. Just cracked open an inch or two, as if someone, or something, had nudged it from the inside. This happened maybe once or twice a week. Another small, unsettling detail in the accumulating pattern of wrongness. The dreams started for both of us around the same time, though we didn't discuss them in detail until later, each perhaps afraid of sounding crazy. My dreams were always fragmented glimpses of a small, translucent figure, almost like heat haze shimmering in the cold corner of the nursery. It felt childlike, but profoundly sorrowful, its form indistinct but radiating that same icy despair I felt when awake near the cold spot. Sarah described similar dreams, sometimes involving the faint lullaby sound weaving through them. We'd wake up not screaming, but with a deep ache in our chests, a lingering chill that took hours to dissipate. Our initial excitement about the nursery had curdled into a shared, unspoken dread. We stopped talking about furniture or decorations for it. The room became a silent testament to a hope that was being slowly frozen out. We debated calling someone a contractor, a paranormal investigator. But what would we say? Our empty room has a cold spot and sometimes makes us sad and maybe moves teddy bears. It sounded absurd even to us. The breaking point came on a cold, clear night. I was jolted awake not by a dream, but by a sound clearer this time, more persistent. A soft, rhythmic whimpering, like a very young infant in distress. It was undeniably coming from the nursery. My heart clenched. Sarah was asleep beside me, breathing deeply. I didn't wake her. A cold dread washed over me, but also a sense of grim necessity. I had to know. Slipping out of bed, my bare feet silent on the hallway runner, I approached the nursery door. It was closed as we'd left it. The whimpering continued from within, faint but steady. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It felt ice cold. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, lit only by the faint moonlight spilling through the window. The cold hit me immediately, far more intense than usual, biting at my skin. The whimpering seemed to emanate directly from the far corner, the heart of the cold spot. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and I saw something. It wasn't solid. It wasn't a ghost like in stories. It was more like the air itself had condensed, gathered, become visible through sheer cold and misery. In the corner, shimmering faintly in the moonlight, was an indistinct, blurry outline. Small, huddled, vaguely the shape of a curled-up infant. It didn't have features, no eyes or mouth, yet I felt, with absolute certainty, that it was aware of me, that it was looking at me. Waves of palpable, icy despair rolled off it, so potent they made my teeth ache and tears spring to my eyes. The whimpering sound seemed to pulse from its very core, a sound of utter, inconsolable sorrow. I couldn't breathe. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, locked in a silent exchange with this condensation of grief. Then, slowly, instinctively, I backed out of the room, pulling the door shut with a soft click, my heart hammering against my ribs. The next day, Sarah and I didn't need many words. The look in my eyes must have told her enough. We didn't try to understand it. We just knew we couldn't live with it. That afternoon, we sealed the nursery. We screwed the door shut from the hallway side with long, heavy screws. We then nailed thick planks of wood across it, covering it completely. We painted over the planks to match the hallway wall. The room, and whatever was inside it, was entombed. The immediate effect was a lessening of the oppressive sadness in the house. The faint sounds stopped, mostly. We tried to forget the room existed. But sometimes late at night, standing in the hallway outside the sealed door, I can feel it. A distinct patch of coldness seeping out from beneath the planks, chilling the floorboards. And occasionally, very occasionally, if the house is deathly quiet, I think I can still hear it. An incredibly faint whimper, or a single, drawn-out sigh, muffled by the wood and plaster. And lately, Sarah mentioned feeling a strange coldness sometimes in the corner of the adjacent guest room wall. We sealed it in, but it's still there. A pocket of unnatural cold and sorrow, trapped but persistent, a silent, chilling reminder bleeding through the walls of the home we had hoped would be our future. We just live around it now, pretending it isn't there, listening to the silence, and dreading the day the cold spreads further. My apartment building is one of those pre-war structures that tries to retain an air of faded grandeur. Marble in the lobby, yes, but slightly cracked. Ornate moldings along the ceilings, but veiled in decades of paint. The hallways are long, carpeted in a pattern that was probably fashionable 30 years ago, and lit by sparse, low wattage fixtures that cast more shadow than light. The air up on my floor, the fifth, usually carries a neutral scent, a blend of stale air, faint cooking smells from other apartments, and the lemon-tinged disinfectant the cleaning crew uses twice a week. It's the anonymous smell of shared living. Or it was. The first time I smelled the lilacs, I was coming home very late from a work function. It must have been close to 2 a.m. As I stepped out of the elevator onto my floor, the usual neutral air was gone, replaced by an unexpected, almost overwhelming fragrance. Sweet, heavy, intensely floral, unmistakably lilacs. It wasn't just a hint, it was a sudden, localized wave of scent, concentrated right there in the stretch of hallway leading to my apartment door, number 5B. My initial thought was practical, if slightly annoyed. Someone's overdone it with the air freshener. I mumbled, fumbling for my keys. Or perhaps a neighbor had received a massive bouquet. But the scent was so potent, so pure. It didn't smell artificial and lilacs. It was deep autumn, they were completely out of season. As I unlocked my door and stepped inside, the fragrance abruptly stopped at the threshold as if hitting an invisible wall. Inside my apartment, the air was its usual neutral self. Strange, I shrugged it off, tired, and didn't think much more about it. But it happened again a few nights later, around the same late hour. That same intense burst of lilac perfume, hanging heavy in the air right outside my door, vanishing the moment I crossed the threshold. This time I paused, sniffed the air more deliberately. It was beautiful, yes, but also melancholic. There was an old-fashioned quality to it, like perfume from a bygone era. And it was definitely strongest right in front of my door, fading rapidly just a few steps down the hallway in either direction. The occurrences became more frequent, though still unpredictable. Always late at night, always localized, I started to feel a prickle of unease. I checked the hallway vents, nothing unusual. I peered at my neighbor's doors, no wreaths, no obvious source. The scent would appear, linger for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, then dissipate as mysteriously as it arrived. Then other small phenomena began to accompany the fragrance. Sometimes, walking into that scented patch of hallway felt like stepping into a pocket of sudden cold. Not just a draft, but a palpable drop in temperature, sharp enough to make my breath mist faintly in the dim light before vanishing as I moved further away. Other times, the air would crackle slightly, the fine hairs on my arms standing on end with an unseen static charge, even though the air was often damp, not dry. These accompanying sensations were fleeting, inconsistent, but they added layers to the strangeness, transforming it from a mere olfactory anomaly into something more. My curiosity piqued, tinged now with a definite nervousness. I decided to do some digging. I casually asked the building superintendent, a gruff man named Sal, if he knew of any reason for strange smells on the 5th floor. He just grunted about plumbing vents and tenants cooking strange food, clearly uninterested. I tried searching online for history about the building, but found little beyond basic construction dates. My breakthrough, if you could call it that, came from Mrs. Davison in 4C. She'd lived in the building for over 50 years, a walking repository of its quiet histories. One afternoon, encountering her in the lobby, I cautiously asked if she remembered anything unusual about the fifth floor, specifically apartment 5EB, my apartment. Her eyes, cloudy with age, seemed to focus on something distant. "Oh, 5B, she murmured, her voice thin and reedy. "That was Eleanor's place." She paused. "Poor dear. Such a sad end." I gently prodded, asking what happened. "Fell ill," Mrs. Davison said vaguely. "Wasted away up there, all alone mostly. Found her after a while. Terrible shame." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "She did love her flowers, though. Especially lilacs. Used to say the scent reminded her of her childhood home." A cold fist clenched in my stomach. Eleanor Lilacs. A sad, lonely end in my very apartment. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The late-night fragrance wasn't random. It felt like an echo. A memory embedded in the very air outside my door. Knowing the story changed my perception of the scent. It no longer felt just strange, it felt poignant, infused with a deep melancholy. But it also felt more personal. Was this Eleanor somehow still lingering? The phenomena escalated slightly after my conversation with Mrs. Davison, as if my acknowledgement had somehow strengthened the echo. The scent seemed to linger longer some nights, and I began to hear things, or perhaps imagine them. When the lilac fragrance was particularly strong, sometimes I thought I could hear, incredibly faintly, the strains of old music. A waltz, perhaps, played on a distant, scratchy phonograph. Or even more unsettling, a soft, wordless humming, feminine and melancholic, seeming to ride upon the scent itself, just at the edge of hearing. Then came the touch. It happened only twice. Walking down the hallway towards my door late one evening, enveloped in the thick, sweet scent, I felt something incredibly light and cold brush against the back of my neck. Like a strand of fine silk, or a single strand of hair carried on a breeze that wasn't there. It was gone in an instant, but it left my skin crawling, goosebumps erupting down my arms. The second time, it felt like the hem of a long skirt brushing against my calf as I fumbled for my keys. Again, impossibly light, colder than the surrounding air, and utterly unnerving. My unease blossomed into genuine fear. This wasn't just a scent memory anymore. The cold, the sounds, the touch, it felt like a presence. A persistent, perhaps lonely, perhaps sorrowful, but definitely present entity tied to the space outside my door. I started dreading coming home late, my heart pounding as I stepped off the elevator, bracing myself for the potential wall of fragrance and whatever might accompany it. The climax, when it came, was quiet, swift, and utterly world-altering for me. I was returning from a late dinner with friends, feeling tired but content. As the elevator doors opened onto the fifth floor, the scent hit me like a physical blow. It was stronger than I had ever experienced it, thick, cloying, almost suffocating. The entire end of the hallway near my door was saturated with the heavy perfume of lilacs. My eyes watered slightly. I walked towards my door, fumbling in my pocket for my keys, my steps muffled by the old carpet. The air felt heavy, charged, the usual dim lights seeming even dimmer through the olfactory haze. As I reached my door, keys finally in hand, about to insert the key into the lock, I saw it out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't solid. It was a shimmer, a distortion in the air near the wall opposite my door, like heat haze but radiating cold. For a fraction of a second, this shimmer coalesced, taking on a vague, translucent shape, unmistakably feminine, tall, slender, wearing something that looked like a long, flowing dress from another era. It had no distinct features, just an outline, pale and luminous in the dim hallway light. And as I watched, frozen, key hovering before the lock, this shimmering form didn't fade or dissipate. Instead, it drifted silently, smoothly, through the solid wood of my apartment door and vanished inside. I stood there for a long time, key in hand, staring at the closed door. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My mind struggled to process what I had just witnessed. The air around me slowly cleared, the overpowering lilac scent gradually fading back to the hallway's usual neutrality. But the image was burned into my memory. It hadn't just lingered outside, it had gone in. I finally unlocked the door and pushed it open, half expecting to find something waiting for me. The apartment was dark, silent, empty. The air inside was normal. There was no trace of lilacs. But that night marked the end of the hallway hauntings. The scent no longer greeted me when I came home late. The cold spots, the faint music, the brushing touches, they all stopped. Because now, sometimes, the scent appears inside my apartment. It's never as strong as it was in the hallway. Just a faint, fleeting whiff, usually when I least expect it. Sometimes near the entryway. Sometimes, more disturbingly, in my bedroom, often late at night as I'm trying to sleep. It never stays long, just a brief, melancholic reminder. I don't feel threatened, not exactly. There's no malice in it, just a persistent, quiet presence. But I no longer feel truly alone in my own home. It's as if Eleanor, or her sorrowful lilac-scented memory, has finally crossed the threshold and decided to stay. I live with it now, this invisible, fragrant roommate. I leave a small vase on my windowsill, sometimes empty, sometimes with a single flower, a silent acknowledgement. We coexist. But every time that faint, sweet scent drifts through my room in the dead of night, I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. Reminded that the veil between lives and afterlives can sometimes be as thin and permeable as a breath of perfume. Time, they say, is constant, relentless, the ultimate objective measure. We rely on it, structure our lives around its steady, predictable march. My grandfather certainly believed so. He was a watchmaker by trade, a man obsessed with precision and the intricate dance of gears and springs. When I inherited his small, quiet house after he passed, I also inherited his old regulator wall clock. It wasn't exceptionally valuable, perhaps, but it was a beautiful piece, dark, polished wood casing, a long pendulum swinging with quiet dignity behind a glass door, a clean white face with elegant Roman numerals and long, slender hands that swept around the dial with what I assumed was unwavering accuracy. Its gentle, rhythmic tick. Tock was the first sound I associated with the house, a comforting, steady heartbeat in the otherwise silent rooms. I hung it in the hallway, where its presence felt both nostalgic and grounding. For the first few months, it kept time perfectly, or so I thought. Its familiar cadence became part of the house's atmosphere. Then, I began to notice discrepancies, small ones at first. I'd glance at the clock as I headed out for work, then check my phone. The wall clock would be maybe 30 seconds behind. Odd, I thought. Must need a new battery. Though I vaguely recalled my grandfather saying it was purely mechanical, driven by weights and the pendulum. Still, I made a mental note to look into it, but the small lag didn't correct itself. It seemed to slowly increase. A week later, it was consistently a minute behind. Then 2 minutes. I tried adjusting the pendulum bob slightly, referencing a faint memory of my grandfather explaining how to regulate it. It seemed to help for a day or two, then the drift would resume. It wasn't losing time at a steady rate either. Sometimes it would only lose a few seconds over 12 hours. Other times it might suddenly be 5 minutes slow when I was sure it had been correct just that morning. It was inconsistent. Annoying, certainly, but I chalked it up to the quirks of an old mechanism in an old house. The real unease began when the discrepancies became more dramatic and entirely unpredictable. I'd reset it carefully against my phone's time, accurate to the second. Hours later, I might find it running 20 minutes slow. Or, stranger still, sometimes almost an hour behind. A significant chunk of time inexplicably vanished from its face. Yet, the pendulum kept swinging, the hands kept moving, just at their own erratic pace. The steady tick-tock sometimes sounded different too, I realized. Usually crisp and even. Occasionally it would seem to falter, developing a slight stutter, tick-tick, tock-tick, or a faint, almost imperceptible echo, as if the sound were momentarily out of sync with itself before resuming its normal rhythm. I became meticulous about checking it against other time sources. My phone, my computer clock synchronized to atomic time. The digital display on the microwave all remained in perfect agreement with each other, marching forward with digital precision. Only the regulator clock seemed to drift, operating in its own bizarre temporal bubble. This constant cross-referencing, initially meant to reassure myself about the clock's problem, slowly started to feel like a reality check for me. The clock was wrong, everything else was right. Therefore, time itself was still stable, wasn't it? Then, the strangeness began to bleed beyond the clock itself. It started with fleeting sensations easy to dismiss, a powerful wave of déjà vu washing over me as I walked past the clock. The feeling, just for an instant, that my own hand lagged behind my intention as I reached for a light switch, like watching a poorly synced film. Or moments where I'd lose a second, I'd glance at the clock, note the position of the second hand, glance away, and immediately glance back, only to feel with jarring certainty that the hand hadn't progressed quite as far as it should have in that brief interval. These moments were accompanied by a peculiar mental stutter, a feeling of my own consciousness briefly buffering. At first, I blamed stress, lack of sleep induced by the annoying clock, and overactive imagination. These subjective glitches were impossible to prove, easy to rationalize away. But they began to happen more frequently, and always, it seemed, when I was near the clock, or had just been thinking about its erratic behavior. I'd be in the middle of a simple task, making coffee, reading a book, and suddenly feel a brief but profound sense of dislocation, as if the world had skipped a beat, or a single frame had been removed from the film of reality. Once, listening to music, a single bar seemed to repeat itself, a tiny loop in the sound that wasn't on the recording. My heart would pound, a cold sweat breaking out, but the moment would pass, leaving me shaken and doubting my own senses. The ticking sound became a source of intense focus. I'd sit and listen, trying to detect those falters, those echoes. Sometimes it sounded perfectly normal for hours. Other times it would develop that strange, slurred rhythm, tick-tock, tick-tock, making my skin crawl. It felt like the mechanism wasn't just faulty, it felt like time itself, within the clock's sphere of influence, was becoming viscous, uneven. My anxiety grew. It was one thing for an old clock to be unreliable. It was quite another to feel like its unreliability was somehow contagious, affecting my own perception of the world's most fundamental constant. Was the clock merely broken? Or was it reflecting, or even causing, localized distortions in time itself? Was I going mad? The isolation of living alone in my grandfather's quiet house didn't help. I had no one to corroborate these fleeting, subjective experiences. I decided I needed to observe it properly, to try and witness one of its significant jumps or failures directly. One quiet Saturday afternoon, I pulled up a chair in the hallway, positioned myself a few feet away, and just watched. I resolved to sit there for as long as it took, keeping my phone handy to verify the real time. The pendulum swung with its steady, hypnotic rhythm. The long minute hand crept almost imperceptibly. The slender second hand swept smoothly around the dial. Tick-tock, tick-tock, an hour passed. Another hour. My eyes grew heavy, the steady ticking almost lulling me despite my heightened awareness. I focused on the second hand following its journey. It swept past the 3, the 6, the 9, climbing towards the 12. It reached the Roman numeral XU at the top of the dial, and it stopped. Just stopped, utterly still. The tick-tock ceased. The pendulum behind the glass continued its swing, but the second hand remained frozen, pointing directly upwards. I held my breath, every nerve tingling. My eyes were glued to the motionless hand. 1 second passed according to my internal count. 2, 3. The silence in the hallway felt absolute, profound. 5 seconds. 6. This wasn't just a stutter, it was a complete cessation of movement. Then, in the exact instant I registered the 7th second passing in my head, Something happened both to the clock and to me simultaneously. The second hand on the clock suddenly blurred. It didn't sweep. It jumped violently, erratically forward, skipping perhaps 15 or 20 seconds in an instant, landing past the 3 with a slightly louder, definitive tock. The ticking resumed, now seemingly frantic for a few beats before settling back into its regular rhythm. But in the exact moment the hand had frozen, my world had fractured. The sensation is hard to describe. It wasn't like fainting. It was more like reality itself hung suspended for those same 7 seconds. The motes of dust dancing in the weak sunlight streaming through the hallway window froze mid-air. The low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen abruptly ceased. My own thoughts felt caught, suspended in amber. There was no sound, no movement, just a feeling of absolute, timeless stasis. Then, with a jarring mental lurch, as if a film reel had violently snapped back into motion, the world restarted. The dust motes swirled, the fridge hummed its low tune, the normal sounds of the house returned. But I wasn't sitting in the chair anymore. I was standing by the front door, several yards away down the hallway, my hand resting on the doorknob. I had absolutely no memory of getting up, no sensation of having moved. There was just before, sitting in the chair watching the clock freeze, and now, standing by the door, with a dizzying, nauseating gap in my awareness connecting the 2 points. The clock was ticking again on the wall behind me. The 15 or 20 seconds it had skipped had also, somehow, been skipped or differently experienced by me. Shock, cold and profound, washed over me, leaving me weak, kneed and trembling. This wasn't just a broken clock. This wasn't just my imagination. This was something fundamentally wrong, a glitch in the fabric of time itself, localized around that old regulator, and I had just experienced it directly. I didn't hesitate. The clock had to go. Carefully, almost reverently, as if handling something radioactive, I took it down from the wall. It felt normal in weight now. I didn't smash it. I wrapped it carefully in old blankets, placed it in a sturdy box, sealed it with tape, and drove it to a storage unit miles away, burying it deep amongst other forgotten belongings. Back home, the silence in the hallway felt different, empty, but clean. The oppressive weight I hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone had lifted. For days, weeks, I felt normal again. Time flowed smoothly, my perception felt stable. I had removed the source, I thought. I had fixed the glitch. But perhaps some glitches, once introduced, can't be entirely fixed. It happens rarely now, maybe once or twice a month, and never lasts more than a fraction of a second. But it happens. A fleeting sensation of reaching for my keys, and my hands seeming to pass through the space they occupy for an instant before connecting. A snippet of music on the radio briefly looping back on itself. A momentary feeling of intense, inexplicable déjà vu, accompanied by that same faint mental stutter. The clock is gone. But the subtle ripples, the faint echoes of temporal instability, remain within my own perception. It's like a tiny crack in the lens through which I view the world, a fleeting reminder that the steady march of time might not be as constant or reliable as we believe. I live with it now, this quiet uncertainty, never fully trusting the smooth passage of the seconds, always subconsciously braced for the next brief, inexplicable skip in the rhythm of reality. We bought the house for its potential, not its perfection. It was an older structure, early 20th century perhaps, that had recently undergone a hasty flip. Fresh paint slapped onto walls that probably hid a multitude of sins, new flooring laid over creaking subfloors. There were compromises, but the price was right, and the neighborhood was quiet. The master bedroom was spacious, albeit oddly shaped, with one long, windowless wall that faced north. It always felt slightly cooler than the rest of the room, and the new plaster seemed flatter, less characterful than the other walls. Just a wall. A blank, unassuming boundary between our sanctuary and the outside world. Or so I thought. The first time I heard the sound, I was lying awake long after my partner had fallen asleep beside me. The house was settling into its nightly symphony of creaks and groans, but beneath that, almost imperceptible, was something else. A faint, rhythmic whoosh. Pause. Whoosh. Pause. Incredibly soft, incredibly slow. My first thought was pipes. Water flowing, maybe the heating system settling down air in the ducts. I listened intently, trying to place it. It seemed to be coming from the wall. That long, blank north wall next to my side of the bed. It wasn't metallic like pipes, nor was it the airy sigh of a vent. It sounded softer, organic, like breathing. No, that was absurd. I told myself it was the wind outside, somehow resonating through the wall cavity, or maybe even squirrels or birds nesting in the eaves, their movements creating a muffled rhythm. I tried to ignore it, burying my head under the pillow. Eventually, sleep claimed me, but the sound returned the next night, and the night after. Always there in the deepest hours of silence. Always that slow, steady rhythm. In, out, like the gentle respiration of some large, sleeping creature. My rational explanations began to feel thin. There were no trees close enough to the north wall for branches to scrape. We had the attic checked, no signs of pests. The heating system was off during these warmer nights. Curiosity, laced with a growing unease, prompted me to investigate further. One night, unable to sleep, I slipped out of bed and pressed my ear flat against the cool plaster of the north wall, right where the sound seemed loudest. The rhythmic whoosh was clearer here, undeniable, and beneath the sound I felt it. An incredibly faint but distinct vibration. A subtle tremor in the solid wall, perfectly synchronized with the slow breaths. It wasn't just sound passing through the wall. It felt as though the wall itself was resonating, pulsing almost imperceptibly. My skin crawled. I snatched my ear away, my heart suddenly pounding. I touched the wall with my fingertips. Cool, solid plaster, nothing outwardly unusual. Yet, the memory of that faint, rhythmic vibration lingered under my skin. I didn't tell my partner at first. How could I? Honey, I think the wall is breathing. It sounded like madness. I kept listening, night after night, hoping it would stop, hoping I was mistaken. But it persisted. Sometimes the rhythm would change slightly, becoming deeper, slower, like a profound sigh. Once or twice, I thought I heard a soft, wet, shuddering gasp mixed in, a sound that made my stomach clench with revulsion. Then came the cracks, tiny, hairline fissures appearing on the surface of the plaster, spider webbing out from a central point about halfway up the wall, roughly where the sound seemed to originate. Again, I tried to rationalize. Settling cracks, I told myself, common in old houses, especially after renovations. But these cracks seemed different. They didn't look like typical stress fractures. And over several weeks, I became convinced, though I desperately tried to deny it, that they were changing, widening ever so slightly, then seeming to narrow again in a cycle too slow to observe directly but noticeable over days. I started taking microscopic photos, comparing them, driving myself half crazy trying to prove or disprove what my gut was screaming at me. The cracks were pulsing in time with the breathing. My anxiety became a constant companion. I found it difficult to relax in the bedroom. Lying in bed, I felt acutely aware of the wall beside me, imagining the slow, rhythmic process occurring within it. My own breathing often felt constricted, tight in my chest, as if the very air in the room was thick and hard to draw. I started sleeping closer to the edge of the bed, angled away from the north wall, sometimes waking up huddled on the very precipice of falling off. The dreams started then, vivid and deeply disturbing. I dreamt I was floating in darkness, enclosed in something warm, damp, and yielding. The walls around me weren't plaster and wood, but slick, fleshy, pulsing rhythmically. I could hear the muffled, booming sound of the breathing, or maybe a giant heartbeat, reverberating through the enclosing membrane. I'd struggle, feeling suffocated, trapped within a vast, living cavity, waking up gasping for air, my skin clammy, the phantom sensation of confinement lingering long after my eyes snapped open. I finally broke down and told Sarah. She listened patiently, her expression a mixture of concern and skepticism. She tried listening at the wall herself, but claimed she heard nothing definitive, maybe just faint house noises. She felt no vibration. She saw the cracks but attributed them to normal settling. She suggested I was overtired, stressed, letting my imagination run wild. I couldn't blame her. It did sound crazy, but her dismissal, however gentle, made me feel even more isolated with my growing terror. The climax arrived without warning, tearing through the fragile veil of my denial. I was jolted awake from a shallow sleep, not gradually but instantly, by the sound. It was loud now, unmistakably loud. Not the gentle whoosh anymore, but a wet, labored gasping. Her, like the breathing of something enormous and gravely ill, struggling for air right on the other side of the plaster. Fear, cold and absolute, flooded me. I scrambled upright in bed, heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it might break through. My eyes flew to the north wall. In the dim light filtering in from the street lamp outside, I could see it clearly. The network of hairline cracks was no longer faint. They were stark against the pale paint, and they were visibly moving, expanding slightly with each ragged inhale, contracting with each shuddering exhale. It was undeniably, sickeningly, pulsing like living tissue, and spreading outwards from the cracks, bleeding into the plaster, was a dark, ugly stain. Brownish red, like old blood or spreading mold. It looked wet, glistening slightly in the dim light. The plaster around the stain appeared soft, almost rotten. A faint, sickly sweet, organic smell, like mildew mixed with something metallic, hung heavy in the air. The wall was breathing. The wall was bleeding. The wall was alive. I don't remember screaming, but Sarah told me later I did. I remember scrambling out of bed, tripping, falling, scrambling backwards towards the door, my eyes locked on that monstrously pulsing, stained section of the wall. Sarah woke up confused, then saw my face, saw where I was pointing, and then she saw the wall. Her gasp was sharp, horrified. We fled the room that night and never slept in there again. We sealed it off, not just locking the door, but physically barring it from the hallway side with heavy furniture. We sleep in the small guest room now, huddled together, feeling like refugees in our own home. The loud, ragged breathing stopped after that night, but the silence isn't comforting. Because sometimes when the house is deathly quiet, we can still hear it. Muffled now, distant, coming from behind the sealed bedroom door. The faint, slow, rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, and sometimes, standing in the hallway outside the barricaded door, we can feel it, that faint, unnatural cold spot has returned, seeping out from under the doorframe. We live here, in this house, with that room, with the wall. We don't know what it is, what's inside it, or if the damp stain is still spreading on the other side. We don't know if the shoddy renovation woke something up, or covered something over that should never have been disturbed. All we know is that it's there, breathing, waiting, a monstrous, organic secret hidden behind plaster and paint. And we live in constant, quiet dread, listening to the faint rhythm through the door, terrified of the day the breathing gets louder again, terrified of the day the wall finally, truly, breaks open. The Prometheus Tower, where I used to work, is the epitome of modern corporate architecture. Gleaming glass facade, minimalist lobbies silent, efficient elevators whisking employees up to climb it, controlled floors bathed in the cool, even glow of recessed fluorescent lighting. Everything is clean, orderly, technologically integrated. It's a space designed to eliminate unpredictability, a sterile environment for focused productivity, which made the phenomenon I started experiencing there all the more incongruous and terrifying. I often worked late. As a data analyst, deadlines could be demanding, and I found the quiet solitude of the office after hours conducive to concentration. The usual daytime bustle replaced by the low, steady hum of servers and the whisper of the HVAC system. It was during these solitary periods either late evenings or sometimes arriving before dawn, that I first noticed the static. Of course, office buildings, especially modern ones with synthetic carpets and controlled humidity, can generate static electricity. A small shock from a metal doorknob in winter is commonplace, but this was different. It started as an annoyance more frequent, surprisingly sharp zaps from filing cabinets, light switches, even the metal frame of my chair. My hair, even on humid days, would sometimes lift and crackle around my head as I walked down certain empty corridors, particularly the long, echoing one leading to the rarely used West Wing conference rooms. My clothes seemed to cling uncomfortably, snapping audibly when I moved. Weirdly dry air today. I'd mutter to myself initially, rubbing my hands together. I tried anti-static sprays, different shoes, grounding myself frequently on metal fixtures, Deller's wincing before each touch. Nothing seemed to make a significant difference. The static felt persistent and strangely potent. Then I began to suspect it wasn't uniform throughout the floor. It seemed worse when I was alone, and it felt localized. I'd walk into the empty kitchenette to refill my water bottle, and the air would feel normal. But stepping back out into the main corridor, or entering the darkened expanse of the main open, plan office space after everyone had left, would sometimes feel like walking into an invisible cloud of charge. The prickling sensation on my skin would intensify. The fine hairs on my arms would stand rigidly on end, and the air itself would seem to buzz faintly around me. Sometimes, I even felt this cloud seem to drift, to follow me for a few steps down a hallway before dissipating. That was the first time the word, natural, truly lodged itself in my mind. Subtle physical anomalies started occurring. Stray pieces of paper left on colleagues, empty desks would sometimes lift at the corners, fluttering slightly as I walked past, even though the air conditioning wasn't blowing strongly. I once saw a small cluster of dust bunnies under a desk seem to dance, levitating an inch or so off the carpet before settling back down. More disturbingly, I saw strands of hair presumably fallen earlier in the day, clinging vertically to a smooth, painted partition wall, defying gravity in a way that made my stomach clench. These were tiny, fleeting incidents, easily missed, easily doubted. But I saw them. The electronics on our floor began acting erratically, especially during my solitary hours. My computer monitor would frequently dissolve into a brief, violent snowstorm of white noise static before snapping back to normal. The large networked printer near my cubicle would jam for no reason, or occasionally spit out pages covered in dense, black, static-like patterns instead of the reports I'd sent. The overhead fluorescent lights, usually steady, would flicker more intensely in certain areas, often accompanied by an audible snap or crackle, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent office. Even my personal cell phone would occasionally emit bursts of static during calls, or the screen would momentarily fill with interference patterns, usually right when that heavy, charged feeling in the air was strongest. The physical sensation on my own skin became almost constant when I was alone in the building. A persistent, low-level tingling, particularly across my forearms and the back of my neck. It wasn't painful, just there. An unnerving awareness of being constantly brushed by invisible electrical charges, and in the deep quiet of the late evenings, sitting at my desk under the lonely pool of light, I started seeing things in the darker corners of the office. Tiny, faint blue sparks discharging spontaneously between the legs of a metal chair and the carpet. A brief, silent arc of light jumping from my own fingertips to a metal pen holder as I reached for it. These weren't imagined, they were real, albeit minuscule. Displays of electrical discharge in places they shouldn't occur. A distinct phobia began to develop. I became acutely wary of touching metal. I'd use my sleeve to open doors, nudge light switches with my elbow, meticulously avoid brushing against the metal dividers between cubicles. I started planning my routes through the office to minimize contact with conductive surfaces. The constant low-level anxiety of anticipating the next sharp, unpleasant zap wore on my nerves. My focus suffered. The quiet solitude I once valued now felt oppressive, charged with an invisible, unpredictable energy. I considered reporting the issues, the flickering lights, the equipment malfunctions. But how could I explain the rest? The levitating dust, the feeling of being followed by a static cloud, the blue sparks, and the fact that it seemed significantly worse, or perhaps only noticeable, when I was alone. I could imagine the skeptical looks from maintenance, the suggestions that maybe I needed a break. So I kept quiet, trying to cope, trying to rationalize. Maybe the building's wiring was faulty in a bizarre way. Maybe there was some environmental factor I wasn't aware of. My breaking point arrived during a late night push to finish a critical project. Outside, a thunderstorm was brewing, the sky occasionally lit by distant flashes, though the rain hadn't started yet. Inside the office, the air felt incredibly thick, heavy, almost vibrating. The static was worse than I had ever experienced it. My hair felt like it was standing almost completely on end. My clothes crackled loudly with every small movement. The smell of ozone, sharp and clean, was distinct in the air. The lights above my cubicle began flickering violently, not just dimming, but strobing erratically, casting the surrounding empty desks and chairs into a disorienting dance of light and deep shadow. The familiar hum of the building seemed to fade, replaced by a high-pitched, almost inaudible whine and a constant, low crackling sound, like crumpling cellophane amplified. Then came the physical pressure. It felt as though the charged air was coalescing around me, wrapping me in an almost tangible field of energy. Movement felt sluggish, difficult, like wading through thick syrup. The tingling on my skin intensified into a near-constant, prickling buzz. I felt contained, trapped within this invisible electrical storm. And then I saw it. In the wildly flickering, strobing light, down the main corridor illuminated by the chaotic dance of the fluorescence, the dust motes, the stray hairs, the tiny scraps of paper on the carpet, they began to move. Not randomly, but drawn together, swirling upwards from the floor as if pulled by an invisible magnet. They converged in the center of the hallway, maybe 20 feet away from me. For a few horrifying, electrifying seconds, this cloud of airborne detritus took shape, coalescing, swirling, crackling. It formed a vaguely humanoid outline, tall, unnervingly thin, perhaps 7 feet high. It had no discernible features, no solidity, just a shimmering, unstable silhouette made of dancing dust and hair, held together by raw static energy. Tiny blue sparks constantly snapped and discharged across its surface, illuminating its shifting form from within. It seemed to writhe, to pulse, its outline constantly dissolving and reforming. It just stood there, a buzzing, crackling effigy of dust and charge. My breath caught in my throat. I was paralyzed, unable to look away, my mind struggling to comprehend the impossible sight. It felt ancient, primal, this raw energy taking shape in the heart of the sterile modern office. Then, with a final, louder crack that seemed to resonate in my bones, the shape imploded. It simply dissipated. Instantly, the dust and hair rained back down onto the carpet. The intense static charge dropped abruptly, the heavy pressure vanishing. The lights steadied, returning to their normal, unwavering fluorescent glow. The corridor was empty again. The silence, apart from the distant rumble of thunder, and my own ragged breathing, rushed back in. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling, slick with cold sweat. Eventually, my legs gave way, and I sank to the floor, leaning against the cubicle wall. The image of that static figure was seared into my mind. I gathered my things, almost mechanically, and left the office immediately. I didn't wait for the elevator. I stumbled down the emergency stairs, my hand flinching every time it brushed the metal railing. I resigned the next day, citing personal reasons. I couldn't bring myself to explain the real reason. I couldn't face going back into that building, especially not alone, not after hours. I moved to a different city shortly after, but the experience marked me. I remain unusually sensitive to static electricity. I still get shocked more often than seems normal. Sometimes in a very dry room, I feel that familiar, faint tingling on my skin begin to build, and a wave of anxiety washes over me. Occasionally, late at night, in the darkness of my own home, I see a tiny blue spark jump from my hand to a light switch, or discharge silently in a dusty corner. It's less intense now, less localized, but it's there. A lingering sensitivity, a permanent attunement, perhaps, to that invisible, crackling energy. I feel as though I carry a faint residue of that office, of that entity with me. It's not tied to a place anymore. It feels more fundamental, and I live with a quiet, persistent wariness, a subconscious scanning of the air around me, forever wondering if the conditions might become right again, if the charge might build, and if the dust might once more stir and take shape in the corner of my eye. Inheriting my great Aunt Alara's cluttered city apartment was less about sentiment and more about the daunting task of sorting through a life lived largely in solitude. She had been eccentric, people whispered, a collector of oddities, a woman content with the company of dusty books and forgotten objects. The apartment reflected this, narrow rooms overflowing with furniture, stacks of yellowing papers, and an atmosphere thick with the scent of lavender polish and old bindings. It was amidst this curated chaos, propped against a bookshelf in the dimly lit living room, that I found the painting. It wasn't particularly large, perhaps 2 feet by 3, set in a heavy, slightly chipped gilt frame. The subject was ambiguous, possibly a man, possibly a woman, dressed in dark, old-fashioned attire that offered few clues to their era or identity. The background was a murky, indistinct wash of deep greens and browns. The skill was competent, but not exceptional, except for one aspect: the eyes. They were rendered with an unnerving realism, dark and intensely focused, seeming to gaze out from the canvas with a startling, penetrating intelligence. They held a depth, a certain knowingness, or perhaps a judgment, that immediately drew me in and simultaneously set me on edge. There was no artist's signature. It was anonymous, intense, and strangely captivating. Against my better judgment, perhaps simply because it filled a large, blank space on the living room wall left by a removed bookshelf, I decided to hang it. It dominated the small room, its gaze becoming the focal point. At first, I didn't notice anything truly unusual beyond the inherent creepiness of those eyes. Of course, like many portraits, it exhibited the classic optical illusion. The eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. I'd walk from the sofa to the doorway and feel that painted stare tracking my progress. I chuckled about it initially, mentioning it to a friend on the phone as one of the apartment's inherited quirks. Standard creepy painting stuff, I'd said, dismissing it. But the feeling persisted. It became harder to dismiss as a simple trick of perspective, whether I was sitting directly opposite it or catching its reflection in the window from the kitchen doorway. The sensation was the same, a direct, unwavering focus. It wasn't just the illusion of being watched. It began to feel like active observation. It felt intentional. Then I started noticing or imagining subtle shifts, tiny, almost imperceptible changes in the portrait's expression. One afternoon, after I'd had a particularly frustrating phone call, I glanced up at the painting and could have sworn the thin, painted lips were tightened, pressed into a line that looked remarkably like a frown of disapproval. Another evening, feeling unusually melancholic, the eyes seemed softer, the expression perhaps holding a flicker of sympathy. I'm projecting, I told myself sternly, attributing my own feelings to a collection of oils on canvas. It was ridiculous. Stress, isolation in this cluttered apartment. Lack of sleep, perhaps, these were the logical explanations. Yet the feeling lingered, and I found myself glancing at the painting more and more often, trying to catch it in the act of changing, studying its impassive features for confirmation of my unsettling suspicions. The wall around the painting also developed a peculiarity. It felt cold. Not just cool, but unnaturally cold to the touch, a distinct patch of chill radiating outward from the frame by several inches. The adjacent walls were room temperature, but this specific area felt as though it were leaching warmth from the air. I'd press my palm against it, feel the cold seep into my skin, and quickly pull away, a shiver tracing its way down my spine. Things escalated subtly. I started finding the painting slightly askew in the mornings, just a degree or two off level, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I'd straighten it, meticulously ensuring it was perfectly aligned, only to find it slightly tilted again the next day, or perhaps shifted horizontally by a fraction of an inch. The building settling, I'd rationalize, or vibrations from the street traffic. But it happened too consistently, always just enough to make me question my own memory and perception. Did I straighten it yesterday? Was it always tilted slightly to the left? A couple of friends who came over to help me sort through some boxes provided unsettling validation. One, Mark, who usually noticed nothing, paused in front of the painting after a while. "You know," he said, trying to sound casual, "that painting is seriously creepy. Feels like it's staring right through you." My other friend, Chloe, shivered visibly. "Tell me about it. I keep thinking its eyes are following me. Gives me the creeps." They laughed it off, but their unprompted comments resonated deeply with my own hidden anxieties. I wasn't just imagining it. The dreams began around the same time. Recurring nightmares where I wasn't looking at the painting, but was inside it. I'd feel the strange paralysis of being composed of paint and canvas, trapped within the frame, unable to move or speak. And the figure from the portrait would be there, sometimes standing beside me in the murky background, sometimes just existing as a presence, observing me with that same cold, detached, knowing gaze. I'd wake up feeling strangely stiff, my muscles aching, sometimes with the faint, cloying smell of turpentine or old oil paint lingering in my nostrils. The unease solidified into a constant, low-level dread. I felt perpetually observed in my own living room. Relaxing on the sofa became difficult. I'd find myself angling away from the painting, trying to avoid its line of sight. I even caught myself murmuring apologies when I accidentally bumped the table near it, then felt utterly foolish. The painting was becoming the silent, judging occupant of the apartment, and I was the intruder. I decided it had to come down. Whatever artistic merit or strange allure it held was vastly outweighed by the oppressive atmosphere it created. One Saturday morning, I gathered my tools, a hammer, pliers to remove the sturdy picture hook grate Aunt Alara had used. I approached the painting with resolve. As I reached up to lift it off the hook, I was stunned by its weight. It felt impossibly heavy, like solid lead, far heavier than a canvas of its size should be. I struggled, my arms straining. Just as I was about to heave it clear, my phone, sitting on the nearby table, rang loudly, startling me. I nearly dropped the painting, managing to only just hook it back precariously. It was a wrong number. Shaken, I tried again. This time, as I gripped the heavy frame, the hammer I'd placed on the floor beside me somehow slipped and clattered loudly against my ankle, making me yelp in pain and lose my grip. It felt orchestrated, like minor, frustrating accidents designed to prevent its removal. Frustrated and unnerved, I gave up for the day. The feeling of being watched intensified after my failed attempt. The subtle shifts in expression seemed more frequent, the gaze harder, more challenging. I couldn't stand it anymore. That evening, I grabbed a heavy dust cloth, climbed onto a chair, and draped it over the painting, completely obscuring it from view. "There," I muttered, feeling a small surge of defiance. "Let's see you watch me now." That night, I woke abruptly in the dead of night. The room was pitch black, silent, but I felt it, an intense pressure, a focused awareness directed solely at me. My heart pounded against my ribs. I strained my ears. Was that a sound? A soft rustle, like fabric sliding against canvas. My blood ran cold. With trembling hands, I reached for the bedside lamp and switched it on. I forced myself out of bed and crept towards the living room doorway, dread coiling in my stomach. I peered into the room. The heavy dust cloth lay crumpled on the floor directly beneath the painting. and the painting itself was exposed. Different. Horrifyingly different. The figure's expression was no longer ambiguous. It was contorted into an unmistakable, sharp, deeply malicious grin. The eyes blazed with a triumphant, cruel light, but it was the hand that made me gasp, a choked sound of pure terror escaping my lips. One painted hand, previously depicted resting demurely at its side within the painted world, now seemed wrong. It appeared closer to the edge of the heavy gilt frame, the painted knuckles rendered with an impossible, almost three-dimensional quality, as if they were physically pressing outward against the taut canvas, the paint straining, preparing to tear, preparing to emerge into the room. I didn't wait to see if it would succeed. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Ignoring the unnatural weight, ignoring the potential for more accidents, I lunged forward, grabbed the frame, and wrenched the painting from the wall with a single, desperate heave. It crashed to the floor face down. I didn't look at it again. I dragged it, scraping against the floorboards, out of the living room and shoved it into a deep, dark storage closet at the end of the hallway, slamming the door and wedging a chair under the knob. The immediate relief in the living room was palpable, the oppressive weight lifting almost instantly. I stood there panting, sweat stinging my eyes, feeling weak-kneed but strangely victorious. But the victory feels incomplete. The painting remains locked away, but the feeling of being watched in the apartment hasn't entirely vanished. It's fainter now, less focused, but still present, like a lingering scent or a stain that won't wash out. And the wall where the painting hung isn't just blank. In the days since, I've noticed something deeply unsettling. There remains a faint, shadowy discoloration on the plaster. It's roughly the size and shape of the figure in the portrait. It's not dirt, not dust, not a trick of the light. It's an outline, seemingly embedded in the very paint of the wall itself, like a photographic negative burned into the surface. A permanent silhouette. I live with this mark now, and sometimes, when the light hits the wall just right, or when I catch it out of the corner of my eye, I could almost swear that faint outline shifts, that shadowy eyes embedded in the plaster are silently observing me. The painting may be locked away, but I fear its gaze somehow remains.